Free Thoughts. I'm Aaron Powell.
And I'm Trevor Burrus.
Our guest today is Chris Lombardi. She's a freelance journalist and co-editor of Democratic Left magazine. Today we're discussing her new book, I Ain't Marching Anymore: Dissenters, Deserters, and Objectors to America's Wars. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Hi, thanks a lot.
How far back does the tradition of American dissent go?
Well, in a sense, it's a country founded on dissent, right? Dissent is in disagreement with the powers that be, and you're talking about a revolution that happened. But I think it actually is earlier than that, because I can track stuff during the French and Indian War, and young recruits saying, "Excuse me, I'm not supposed to be doing this," or "I don't want to do this anymore," or "My contract is only 5 years, now you want me to keep serving," and that doesn't make any sense. So it's back in 1754 is what I always think of.
You mentioned contracts, and this is one of the things I found really interesting about the early portions of the book was how much of the objections, there was certainly a lot of religious dissent at the time, but how many deserters or dissenters were essentially grounding it in contract disputes. How did those work at the time? What did these contracts look like? Because we tend to think more of the military today as just you've joined up and now you're just kind of part of this thing, as opposed to being a contract arrangement.
The contracts were, in the beginning, they were like 3 years. It was just basically as long as they thought the battle was going to go, or the campaign was going to go. It evolves. In the very beginning, soldiers could elect their officers. Also, it was a much more democratic kind of situation. A contract, you're talking about when citizen is like a new concept. Suddenly I'm a citizen and I have rights, and this is one of the rights I have, is if this institution has entered a contract with me and doesn't deliver what it said it would do, I have a right to stop doing what I do.
Was there any attempt to force, so Quakers are the most famous dissenters of the Revolutionary era. I mean, did that cause people to be angry, especially if the time being like, everyone has to do their part to split off from Great Britain? Were the Quakers seen as someone who were not doing their part, or was there any attempt to overcome their objections and put them into armies?
The Quakers, as you know, have been making trouble since 1700s, 1600s, and they were making trouble then. They were starting to make trouble about slavery at one point when the Second Amendment is being debated, and they realized that the Quakers already were getting to people about that they were starting to speak out about slavery. So they certainly, the relationship of governments to what they call the peace churches was always dynamic and strange. But by then, actually, it had evolved that peace churches at least had a right to negotiate that stuff. They could buy out the contract of someone, and they could say that we help alternative service. Now, if you had someone that wasn't a Quaker, they were out of luck. My book starts, as you know, with a young man who was Lutheran. And he's standing in the middle of a bottle of brandy wine saying, "Oh my God, God tells me I shouldn't be killing anybody." And he stood there and let the warders fly in his ears because he didn't want to do it. And he ended up getting in prison for a while. And eventually became a Quaker after. There's been a dynamic situation of, there's a point where it's almost not dissent. We've got the government saying, "Okay, you get to do that instead." And then people go, "Wait a minute, I still want it to be dissent."
Were there non-religious dissenters? Was there philosophical dissent back then?
I think there was. We don't know much about, because what there were record of is the peace churches. That's who keeps track of this stuff. But I know that there are poets who talk about it as far back as the Revolution. In those days, I think if you had this belief that it was wrong, if you had to be coming from God. The concept of non-religious beliefs was kind of alien.
And you mentioned slavery, but could you talk a bit more about the ways that abolitionism and anti-slavery movement, and then also there's a lot about treatment of Native Americans factoring into early American dissent, like how those played out?
It's funny because all the new scholarship about Native Americans, I feel guilty suddenly. Like all of my people are bad guys because they're taking land away from Native Americans. Awareness of that is unfortunately kind of sparse among actual people who are actually helping the government enforce their foreign policy or their domestic policy. I talked a little bit about Simon Girty, who was a white Indian actually, who was a translator for the army until he saw what they were doing, and he ended up defecting to Canada. And I talked about William Mapes, who was half Indian, half African American, who when he was actually enlisted, thinking, "Do I really want to fight the wars of the white man?" He did anyway, and he was treated very badly. And he did serve out his term, and ended up becoming an activist afterward on behalf of Native Americans. So I have these few people that I can point to saying resistance to settler colonialism is part of the trend I'm tracking, but it's relatively sparse, I think. The slavery thing is a whole nother dynamic. I think that your uncle of mine read my book and he said, it's about race. It's not all about race, but just figuring out how racist you are is certainly part of the dynamic of anyone thinking about how to be in this country. And the abolitionists, there's a whole business of, at some point, they weren't pacifist anymore because they were really into, we have to have a war against these guys. The peace movement kind of fell apart after the Civil War. It wasn't respectable anymore to be just pacifist because you want to, John Brown died for you, kind of. It's funny. I think about peaceful organizations. The most pacifist ones are kind of the canary in the coal mine, saying this is wrong, and then people who are less pacifist are saying, you're right, and I understand against it, but it's hard.
We saw, as you mentioned, the Quakers did have special solicitude, and your story about the Lutheran at the Battle of Brandywine did not receive that solicitude. But did we see in the antebellum period, or maybe up to the war, did we see a growth in the religions, the different kind of belief systems that did receive solicitude for their objections to wars? Or was it just the Quakers who had this sort of special exemption that others weren't given?
Well, I mean, I say Quakers, but there's Mennonites, Brethren, the whole group of peace churches out there. And I think that some of them did grow more during what they call the First Great Awakening, which is the period leading up to the Civil War. And what I'm thinking now, in terms of the kind of resistance that I'm noticing back then, though, it's less religious than, as you said, the contract being violated or being underfed. That the United States, you think we underpay their soldiers now, they're really underpaid soldiers. Then, Washington was being complaining about this. Everybody's complaining about this. But the way that rank and file soldiers complain about it is they could desert, and they did.
What happened to deserters? The people who, say, ran off, deserted because of a contract dispute, because they said, I'm not being fed or whatever. What did the military do to them, or how were they treated?
Well, it changed. At one point, Washington kind of cracked down. But at some point, the deserters, they just lost half of your crew, and you could keep going. But by the time of the Revolution, a lot of high profile mutineers were actually executed, actually shot.
On the mutineers or the deserters, was it possible to have your case? So we talked about the contract aspect, where someone could say, I enlisted for 2 years, or I enlisted for 3 years, and then walk away. And this was always a problem, as you pointed out. Like, this was something that Washington struggled with to keep the army together, and it occurred a lot in the Civil War. Was it possible could you walk away? So if you were correct that your 3-year enlistment was up and you wanted to leave camp and walk back home, were they going to catch you for that too, or did they let you go?
I mean, it's possible they wouldn't. I mean, you're talking about, you don't have huge armies of military police out there to grab you. So it's possible that, what's his name? Jacob Ritter was captured by the British, not by the Americans. But it was not the standard, obviously. And we didn't have appeals processes. You can't now, if someone wants to get out of the military, they can appeal. They can negotiate, right? Council to negotiate with the officer and saying this doesn't make any sense. You don't want them anymore. But those kind of structures didn't exist back then.
But on that, one of the interesting things that you mentioned in the book is that early draft of the Second Amendment contained a conscientious objectors clause, effectively, a carve-out that was removed.
Written by, what's his name, Madison. Madison actually wrote that.
What did it say, and why was it taken out?
It was originally No person religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person. That was the line that got cut out, that Madison had included with the rest of the right to bear arms. It was really about people's right to their own autonomy, and it included the right to not have to fight in your wars. But this is probably the hate of the Quakers is one of the reasons that it got cut out.
I imagine, but it's fairly broad though. It says religious scruples, so it seems like it could encompass like the Lutheran at Brandywine. We will never know, I guess, but there are. I mean, in the future, where there are other objections under the free exercise clause that people made to service in the military, of course.
There's a lot of conversation in the CO community about how we can possibly take advantage of all this extra religious freedom that the Hobby Lobby types have secured, and how we can extend that to people who realize they can't be in the military. Hasn't happened yet.
So if we go up to the Civil War, I was interested in from both sides of this. So from the Confederate side, I mean, we definitely have border states and people like this not really getting into the army, but or actively fighting against the Confederacy. Did the Confederates have conscription? Did they use conscription? And did they?
They did.
Sort of
they did.
Mm-hmm. And then they forced.
It was
people,
one of those poor men. You know, poor men gets recruited for rich men's needs.
Did they not care about objections in that context?
It was not. There wasn't a bunch of posts. There were Quakers in the South who were trying to make this happen. I don't know a lot that's recorded.
And as for the North, we have some very interesting resistance to the draft, of course.
Yeah, well, there's the whole racism thing there, and the draft riots. It's always the Civil War kind of flips the script on looking at a war that you're talking about resistance to, because people who were fighting it thought of themselves as resistors. They're resisting the slave power, so it's more complex. But I decided at a certain point that I was going to look at the whole context of what resistance meant in those days, and that included the people who were fighting. And that's how you end up with talking about 54th, Massachusetts 54th, and the black soldiers who realized that they were fighting for something much more important than anybody was realizing at that time.
Well, this brings up, there's one of the interesting things in the book is how there's kind of very different perspectives represented within this broader anti-war or objector movement. And one of them is, maybe you can explain this, is the difference between people who consider themselves just non-combatants and then what I think we call like absolutist conscientious objectors.
I mean, it's not really a book about conscientious objection. I start with conscientious objector, but I'm talking about all kinds of resistance beyond that. Absolutist conscientious objectors are people who don't want to do alternative service, don't even want to work at a hospital because they don't want to support the structure, the military structure. And you know, as a middle-aged lady, I'm like less patient with those guys now. But you know, the guy in World War I who was going to stay in the jail no matter what happened, and they treated World War I conscientious objectors very badly, but he wanted to stand up for what he believed to an extreme. And then there are others who say, okay, I'll be in jail for a while, or I'll help, you know, build the fort, but therefore I'm not carrying a weapon. So it's a range always.
Do we see a post-Civil War growth in the nature of these objectors? Because if you think about the time, as you said at the beginning, it's religious and contractual to some degree. And then the Civil War, and then we have a growth in different types of religions, but we also have a growth in just general learning in society, for example, so people can make philosophical objections to this. And so do we see just sort of a divergence of, you know, sort of left-wing anarchists of the late 19th century, or different types of different religious sects, or other people who just have a philosophical objection? Is that kind of a movement that starts gaining ground after the Civil War?
Well, after every war, there's sort of an anti-war movement that evolves after. People don't want that kind of damage anymore. Now, with the Civil War being what it is, kind of singular. But Josephine Shaw Lowell was one of the big fighters against the Philippine War. So, excuse me, my brother got killed in a real war, and now you're going to send people to fight this one, and there's all that, and you have that certainly with the Vietnam War and people who are World War II veterans who say, "Excuse me, my war was worth it. This one is not." And there's that whole back and forth with that. It's something we say about secular. It's definitely the people that are visible in World War I and after are much more secular. It's true, even if they have a religious background.
What was the relationship between anti-war dissent and objection and the early women's rights movement?
There's an intersection there for sure. I mean, there's a women's rights movement you're talking about in the 19th century. It's the Women's Peace Party and all that. There's a lot of people who were involved in suffrage efforts early. A lot of them were involved in women's peace movements. You're talking about certainly in the beginning of the 20th century. You got Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which was founded after the Civil War, around in the early 1900s, and they become a big enough group that they were supporting other women's struggles as well, including suffrage. But in the Philippine War, there's also the business of there's the Anti-Imperialist League, and then there's a women's organization which is not the Anti-Imperialist League because that's all it's racist and sexist, but they do a lot of the heavy lifting, and they actually talk to young soldiers who are trying to speak out and help that happen.
You mentioned the Philippines War a couple of times, and that's a particularly interesting one, and often forgotten, the Spanish-American War, often forgotten, I think, by Americans for how brutal it was and how imperialistic it was. But we had on a couple of years ago Stephen Kinzer, who wrote a book called The True Flag about the dissent in that war in a political environment. Did we see, I mean, it was a strangely brutal colonialistic war that many people thought went against America's sort of core values. So did we see a pretty big ramp up in dissent just to that war in particular?
The Anti-Imperialist League was a very odd duck. I talked to Evan Thomas about it. His daughter wrote a whole book about because Evan Thomas is descended from one of my characters actually, and his daughter wrote a book about that. But his book, The War Lover, which is his book about Teddy Roosevelt, who fought in the Spanish-American War, and he just brushed off the group as feckless. But it was very odd. It was an odd group. You had Andrew Carnegie. You had all these rich people who were saying, "Excuse me, this is not really good for business." And then you had all these Civil War veterans who were saying, that was my war. And then you have the Women's Christian Temperance Union. That's when you talk about women's groups and the whole dynamic that happens. So it was, and they did not have. Eventually, it had a colored auxiliary, which is really kind of very plus versa for Ferguson. But they did not engage with the huge number of black soldiers who were fighting, and that became some other dimension that had happened there. So as a lobbying group, it was some kind of feckless because they didn't really know what they were doing in terms of how to actually appeal to the government, saying that this doesn't make any sense. Mark Twain was the most visible, obviously, of that league, and he, like many people, started off saying, "Yes, we do need to help those people in Philippines civilize," but no, realizing that was not what's happening.
Picking up on Mark Twain, was there a in this early period, so let's say pre-World War I, was there a robust anti-war literature? In the book you talk about Ambrose Bierce, but was that a thing? And what influence did kind of anti-war, particularly fiction, have?
Ambrose Bierce actually invented anti-war literature. He invented war literature, actually. And, we have this bizarre dynamic of war literature. People read it because it's moving and fascinating, but then that we keep making more war movies because we love the war so much. But there was the Red Badge of Courage, which is also an anti-war book, but that was not by a veteran. My criteria for who gets me in this book, because otherwise it's everybody, is they have to have worn a uniform at some point the villainless in some way. I mean, Bayard Rustin is in there because he was in J-Rotzi. So that doesn't have to be much. But Stephen Crane's not in there for that reason. I mean, this whole intense anti-war movement between the wars that includes basically everybody, and includes a lot. And between the Civil War and Philippines, there's a sense that war is a destructive, terrible thing. But there's also a sense of, I want my young man to go be a patriotic human being. So I will let that happen.
We've talked a bit about race, and one of the striking things was it seemed like there were a lot of people, and this I think is most of the people that we've been talking about so far, who objected to participation in wars on anti-imperialist, pacifist, like the problem is the fighting itself grounds. But there also was a history of people who objected to conscription, enlistment, and so on because the military was segregated, or because different racial groups were treated differently within it. And so it seems like their problem was less with war itself and more that they weren't going to be equal participants in it if they were forced into it. Was there conflict between those? Because they seem to be working at very different purposes.
I think there's more of an alliance going on, actually. Look, NACP was a group of founded by blacks and whites together, some of whom have been veterans, some of whom have not. And you mentioned being forced to. It's the whole concept of the resistance saying that if you're going to make me be part of this thing that sustains your country, you better treat me right. You have Winifred Lynn, who was a CO against segregation. He said, I will go fight in the Canadian Army, but I'm not going to fight in your army unless you desegregate it. I mean, I see your point, but I think that when you have people who were standing up against military segregation for the most part, they knew the mixed bag that war was. They weren't saying, we have to do this. W. Du Bois decides, okay, the war is happening, therefore I want to make sure that black people are treated right. Du Bois, a big peacenik for most of his life. But in 1918, he writes an editorial saying, we have to come together and support this war. And therefore, by the way, you have to treat black soldiers right. That did not happen, but he tried. But he ended up being arrested for running a peace center in the 1950s.
That brings us to the interesting World War I anti-war movement in America. Of course, there was a broad anti-war movement internationally before the war, led mostly by socialists and left-wing and Christian nationalists and a bunch of different groups. But from a troop side, we did see the sort of inauguration of a draft in World War I. I mean, it wasn't the first draft, and two, we had things like the Espionage Act and all these kind of actions against people who spoke out against the war. It seemed like that ramped up a significant amount in the World War I era, the sort of persecution of anti-war people, soldiers or otherwise. Was there a true kind of renaissance of dissenters during World War I in America compared to previous wars?
I don't know if a renaissance, but it certainly was a place where you had dissent of any kind be counted. People who would not have necessarily been a public dissenter at all, saying, I have to stand up in the middle of this war and do something. And you just saw that. And you talk about the Espionage Act and Sedition Act as well. There's a whole business of which publications are going to be clamped down on, and certainly in terms of the war that's going on, what's that going to do for the constituency that you're trying to serve? Yeah. There's the Messenger, A. Philip Randolph's thing, cracked down on hugely. Du Bois was not, because he agreed to affirm the war. When Red Summer's coming up, you've got actual physical casualties from that stuff.
Can you tell us about Smedley Butler, who he was?
I was so glad to be able to I don't know what was going to make fit him in, because it's a card book, and it's already a Russian novel, right? Too many characters, too many plots. But life is too many plots, too many characters. I'm so glad Adam Hochschild was my sort of mental mentor, because wait a minute, if he does that, I can do that. But Smedley Butler was he was Mr. Military Man his entire life, and he realizes at a certain point around World War One that he's been fighting for the resources, for natural resources. All the wars he fought in were for natural resources. So he retires and he's like, nope, I'm not going to do this. And he wrote several books. He spoke at the Bonus March, which is one of my other favorite things to talk about. And he joined the Socialist Party, actually. But he's very clear-eyed about what he had done and that he needed to try to make up for it.
And what kind of influence did he have? I mean, was he taken seriously by people because of his military background? Or
well, yeah, I mean, he was a police commissioner in Philadelphia. As someone who lives in Philadelphia, I find it amusing that he then left. He could not team Philadelphia. He didn't become president or anything, but he was taken seriously. I mean, you know, the fate of who are outside the mainstream politically, and that was that way too.
I'm well aware of that.
Especially at the time, yes, yeah. And if you join the Socialist Party, you might be in prison. Now, it seems that when people think about wars, especially ones that America has been involved with, if we going up to World War II, well, that's the just war. That's the
good war, right?
That's the one that needed to be fought. That's the one that, you know, on both sides. But I don't think that opinion was as broadly held. Maybe for a few reasons, maybe anti-Semitism, for example. But there were dissenters to World War II, also, correct?
There were. I mean, mostly I talk about Lou Ayres, who was an actor who decided he had been in the movie All Quiet on the Western Front. And he decided that he did not want to get involved in something that traumatic. But he also wanted to support the war by being a non-combatant. Opposing the war itself was harder and harder once the consciousness of what was happening with the Nazis. So it was, you know, you had Quakers who refused to serve, but in those days there was the agreement that they could. And there was civilian service program. And you had these little encampments where people would do medical experiments. They would build someone else's farm. They would do something alternative. And however, as you said before, then they decided to resist the segregation going on in those camps. And you have the reason that they stopped having civil service program camps is that you basically got a generation of well-trained dissenters. National Public Radio was founded by those guys who were in those camps. It was a school for dissent.
What role did Hollywood play in this? You mentioned All Quiet on the Western Front, which was, of course, an extremely important novel, but then was turned into this quite important movie. And there's a world of difference, I think, between people reading fiction that describes war and being actually able to see the brutality of it on a large screen. And so Hollywood, you know, Hollywood was, of course, in the Red Scare, was bashed for being pro-communist and so on. But like, was Hollywood largely anti-war? Was it hard to make anti-war films in Hollywood early on? What was that like? And what were the kind of major players in this?
What I know about World War I, it's World War II is the area where you've got Hollywood is in industrial strength, getting as many pro-war movies as they could possibly get made. It's interesting because, in general, Hollywood is more anti-war, but they also are dependent on the government for cooperation to film anything involving a war. Got to get that plane, got to get those, and it's a strange dynamic, and that was true in World War I and World War II as well. I mean, I have a friend who wrote this biography of Lou Ayres called Hollywood's Conscious Objector, which talks a little bit about how that movie was received and how that movie was changed. In the run-up to World War II, they took some stuff out, and they put a new frame on it, saying, you know, then we have to deal with the new German threat.
I think if you go from something like Audie Murphy, who became a Hollywood star after being the most decorated American soldier in World War II, and the kind of movies that they had there, and then you run forward to say, you know, Apocalypse Now. Obviously, the interim event there is Vietnam, which maybe is the thing that actually changed most of not just Hollywood's inclination towards war and their attitude towards war, but also Americans more broadly and their view of dissenters to these kind of wars, would be my guess.
I think that there's an appeal that war has to performers that even veterans who are very anti-war will say, this movie is great because it got war right. And that we're all kind of pulled toward that stuff, whether we want to or not.
So I guess that does get to the question about Vietnam, because for most people, and maybe that's one of the things that your book is trying to explain the broader, longer history of this. But for most people, when they think about anti-war dissenters, they think about Vietnam.
They think about hippies.
They think about hippies and quote unquote draft dodgers and the burning your draft card and all these kind of things, which it's an interesting time, but it didn't begin that way. I think in say 1960, when we were still doing a quote unquote police action in Southeast Asia, we didn't see that level of that. Is there any sort of moment that kind of ramped this up, or individuals that maybe were the people who really pushed this forward during that era?
Well, I mean, you tell me about Jeff Sharlet. You can make me talk about Jeff Sharlet, who was an intelligence officer who was there in the early years of the war, and he noticed what was going on, and he noticed that this was a police action that was obviously, we were on the side of whoever we wanted to be, but it's not necessarily helping the people on the ground, and people were dying, people were suffering. And he comes back and goes to college in the GI Bill and ends up editing a magazine called Vietnam GI, which is one of the first big GI publications. Ultimately, there were 300 or so of these publications at every military base in the country and in the world. And just putting together what was happening and opposing what was happening. And it was something that I only managed to do a little bit of in my book, not so much, but that this GI press was when the superiors at the army decided to start looking at this stuff, and they noticed it's like, oh my goodness, and they quote in the report only quoted the bad stuff, quoted that kill your officer kind of stuff, and that was not what most of them were about. But they had jokes, they had testimony of what was happening every single time, every stage. They were the ones that first recorded things like National Guard troops who would not act against civilians in Chicago. What we know about what's happening there was from that press. And Jeff Sharlet started that. He was one of the first, and he saw what was happening early on. And then, of course, the other I can talk about is all those World War II veterans who noticed really early. What's his name? Stoughton Lynd, who was a Quaker who then was actually a 1AO objector during Korea, who was on a train. He was active in support of the Civil Rights Movement, and he saw news of what was happening in Vietnam and said, "Oh, that's what I should be doing now." And he's a giant in all of this. And people like Philip Berrigan and Howard Zinn said, "This cannot stand." And they saw early what was going on, and they were the first layer that went on there.
I think for our listeners might not know this too, but the arguably the beginning of the modern American libertarian movement, or certainly the modern American young libertarian movement, was the 1969 Young Americans for Freedom convention, when the libertarians got together and organized a draft card burning, and then got thrown out. And that was kind of the start of the libertarian movement separating off. But can you, one of the main, most prominent people in Vietnam dissent was John Kerry, who a lot of our listeners probably only remember as the defeated presidential candidate, and maybe they heard about the swift boating of him. But can you tell us what he was doing, in particular the Winter Soldier, what that was?
John Kerry was a young man who, as we know, was in the military, but he was in the military partly. He was a fairly privileged young man, so he went and was the first support operator during Vietnam. And then he joined the Vietnam Veterans Against the War at the moment that was happening its most intense phase of power. And right after My Lai massacre, when the trial of the main perpetrator was happening, all the people who were in the organization said, "Excuse me, that happens every day. That's happening all the time in Vietnam. We have to make this more public." And they had these hearings in Detroit. They did it in Detroit because they thought, "Oh, we'll do it in Detroit. That shows we're of the people." Instead of doing it in DC or New York, we'll do it in Detroit. And people I talked to, they were like, "I don't know what's was spoken when they decided to do that." But they had these hearings that happened over 3 days in February, and it got zero press. I mean, it got local press in Detroit, but the rest of the country was paying attention to the moonshot. It's 1971, so it's the third moonshot, and John Kerry says to them at VVW, we should go to DC. We should actually just go and take over all of DC. And unlike what happened this past January, they went to practice democracy, and hundreds of Vietnam veterans went to DC, and Kerry most famously spoke at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which you were referring to, I think. He said the same things that he was saying at Winter Soldier, but to the Senate hearing room and to the nation. And then at the end of the week, they all threw their medals in the pot. These are people who had earned Purple Hearts and all of that, and Bronze Stars, saying this is none of this is worth anything because I know what's happening in Vietnam right now. That was a very powerful moment, and it's a moment that Kerry has refused to talk about ever since. He wrote a book called The New Soldier. Have you seen it? It's a very earnest book. It's hard to get a hold of it. I dug really hard to get it, and I don't have a copy of it, but it's very much we're reading a new world. We're doing something important, and they have pictures of the whole week, from the hearing room and the whole encampments. He then went on. I mean, he went on to become a senator, as you know, and then became who he is now. He's now climate envoy. But I tried to contact him because I was writing about Winter Soldier. This was for Work on Violence, and he got officially declined. At least he knew that somebody was trying. Jane Fonda wouldn't do it either.
I'm not terribly surprised about Jane Fonda. It is interesting though, because I talked to my parents who went to college in the 60s. I mean, in Oklahoma, so they were on the East Coast or something. But the way that I feel like our country has generally, I mean, there's exceptions, but come to remember Vietnam takes the dissenters and raises them to a much higher level than they were thought of at the time, which was, being absolute traitors to United States and, maybe pseudo communists or something like this, that we now remember Vietnam, as if you weren't against it at the time, or you'll say, well, I was never quite for the war or something, because being against Vietnam is super, super cool now, which kind of means that, it was an absolute catastrophe of a war in ways that are hard to even explain, but that it was ultimately good for dissenters, like in the image, and just the idea of being against war is something that you can validly be and you can stand up for and receive respect for that. Would you agree with that?
During Iraq, that the whole country can turn on a dime and say, no, anti-war is not anything shown to be.
Oh yeah, when the drums of war start beating,
consent gets manufactured every war.
That's like we had the Vietnam protests, but then that led to kind of a renewed jingoism under Reagan. And so can you talk about that? And particularly, it was interesting. I like the discussion about the movie Rambo as somewhat representative of this.
People have been dissertations about Rambo as this masculinist ideal. There's a lot of rage going on afterward, and people who were not in the anti-war movement felt somehow victimized by it. And there's a whole like I'm grabbing that energy and running with it, which is what Reagan did. So that white nationalists did too. You know, Vietnam veterans who were not anti-war felt completely marginalized and insulted by anti-war veterans, and they took it very seriously. And then some of them nurtured their already existing prejudices and said, we have to fight for a new white world. And the white nationalist movement that we saw in Oklahoma City was that started there. There's a book by Kathleen Below about this. Rambo, it's funny because the very first Rambo movie is pretty anti-war, but then it gets metastasized into what it's become since. And I think Rocky 7 or something. You've got to create a whole nother consciousness around that. So when the Reagan era, that's just beginning.
Bringing us up to the present day, how did the rise of electronic warfare, so you talk a lot about drones and drone operators, and also the internet, change the nature of the anti-war movement?
Well, we're talking about the present day. We're also talking about a volunteer army. We're talking about an entirely different situation. Even though the majority of people who fought in earlier wars, a lot of them were also enlisted anyway. But certainly Vietnam, most of them had enlisted. But we're talking about armed forces have been shipped over to professionalized. I'm looking at this whole trend right now. I'm working on a chapter on conscious objection for a textbook. And that Europe and the United States have done this transition to a military caste, to a poverty draft, and we rely on those other people that we're hiring to do this now. And that was, when you're talking about electronic, the drones in that drone war, you're asking some of the smartest of the crew we're grabbing and getting them to do that. And so the dissent happens on such an individual level. It's because they're not supported by anybody except groups like I used to work for. That when you're working on the drone program and you realize that what's happening and you don't want to be part of that, it's a very, very individual search for a solution. And that's why you get the whistleblowers, that what I'm seeing is wrong and you have to see it. And so you end up with Chelsea Manning. You end up with Reality Winner, though she wasn't dissenter about the war. She was dissenter in terms of information that was happening during the election. But it's just a much more difficult path.
That kind of seems to not bode too well for the future of it doesn't bode too well for the future of anti-war necessarily in this, or dissenters. If A, as you said, we have this military class, and B, our wars are increasingly fought with drones and other types of removed technology. So, and we don't have a draft right now. I mean, we still have registration for the draft, but we don't. Most of our American war efforts have been trying to put fewer boots on the ground in these situations, so you can fight a war in Libya with robots and precision, quote unquote, targeting. So then it's much less about standing up and saying, I refuse to march, because they're not marching anywhere. And I guess rather doing kind of the stuff you mentioned, leaking, dissenting to the way we fight the wars, and going against a thing that you probably voluntarily engaged in, as opposed to, say, a draft, in the case of Chelsea Manning, for example.
But if you don't need people, they would not have, however it is, 1.8 million people in uniform right now. So I think that it's true that trying to build a movement around that is more challenging. But refusal to cooperate with the institution is still a refusal to cooperate with the institution, and that can make that happen. It's not easy to do, though. It's really not easy to do. I mean, I think that there is a point to organizing. It is a point to organizing. It's not, and I think that the path to anybody that wants to be part of this still is to talk to people that are supporting GIs that call in, people who are actually doubting it, understanding what's going on, or should support Daniel Hale, who's in prison now for having leaked about the drone program right this second. There's a lot of stuff you can do easily, or contact the Biden administration and say, "Are you sure you want to spend $800 million right now, the Pentagon right now, the second. Everything else you're trying to do, a lot of things you can work on. It's as challenging as it's ever been, but it's still possible.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoy Free Thoughts, make sure to rate and review us in Apple Podcasts or in your favorite podcast app. Free Thoughts is produced by Landry Ayers. If you'd like to learn more about libertarianism, visit us on the web at www.libertarianism.org.